The topic is faith and critical race theory. Our presenters are from the Christian, Jewish, and Islamic faith traditions. One of the questions we're entertaining tonight is, how does faith inform our discussions on racism in America? This is not a name-calling session. This is a discussion. And hopefully at the end of it, we will have learned a little bit more about each other. My name is Khalil Shadid. I am the founder of Faith Matters Islamic Center, and I am the one of the organizers of this discussion. And my partner in crime here is Tamika Washington. She is the founder of the Interfaith Coalition of Bowie. Those of you who don't know, Bowie is a lovely city in the suburbs of Maryland. Tamika will be serving as our moderator, and she is excellent at doing that. Before getting started, however, I wanted to just thank the panelists for accepting the invitation. Dr. Brian Harrington from the Christian tradition, Martha Woody from the Jewish tradition, Dr. Hakeem Rasheed from the Islamic tradition, and Reverend J.W. Park from the Christian tradition. They accepted the invitation, and this is usually a very controversial topic, so I'm glad that they had the courage to step in. Each of the presenters will have an opening statement of 5 to 8 minutes. There was a scholar who said to me that before you start conversations, you probably want to define the terms. So I will attempt to do that. A definition for faith, I think that would unite the people from the Abrahamic tradition, or people from the Abrahamic tradition, is the belief and trust in God and the loyalty to God, belief in the traditions of their religion. And I will say also that the definition for critical race theory are many. I have yet to find people who actually agreed on a single definition of critical race theory, but here is mine. It is an academic method, philosophy that students can use to understand and discuss systemic racism in America. This covers a lot of discipline and a lot of areas. It goes from governments to economics to education. Our focus tonight, however, is on theology. The question is, how does faith inform our discussion on racism in America? Needless to say, everything I mentioned is controversial. Historically, people of religion have justified exclusivity, systemic racism, and racial segregation. However, it is our mission for this discussion and hope tonight that we can start the building of bridges, understanding each other, and start. We're probably not going to end the discussion, but we'll at least kick the ball down the road a little bit in trying to dismantle racism in America. With that, I will turn this program over to our moderator, Tamika Washington, who will introduce the speakers.
Thank you, Khalil. As he said, my name is Tamika Washington. I'm the founder and president of the Interfaith Coalition of Bowie, and I am happy to welcome our wonderful presenters this evening. We have Dr. Brian Harrington. He attends First Baptist Church in Martinsville, Virginia, where his wife, Reverend Ashley Harrington, serves as the interim minister to children and families. And he is starting his own podcast titled Faithful Justice. They do have a website, which I will put in the chat at the end of the introductions. We also have Martha Woody, a longtime member of the Ohad Zion Synagogue in Martinsville, Virginia, and she is on its board of directors. We have Dr. Hakeem Rasheed, who is the professor and former chairman of the Department of Human Development and Psychoeducational Studies at Howard University here in Washington, D.C. And last, but certainly not least, we have Reverend J.W. Park, who is a relatively new pastor at St. Matthew's United Methodist Church here in Bowie, Maryland. So we will kick it off to the presenters to start their presentations, and we'll start with Dr. Harrington.
Thank you all so much for inviting me to be a part of this tonight. I'm so thankful for this invitation, especially because the relationship between faith and race is something that I have been studying and researching for the last few years as a part of the Doctor of Ministry degree program that I just finished at Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary. But let me jump into my opening remarks for tonight. This morning, our sisters and brothers in Ukraine woke up to the sounds of war. Some of those Ukrainians in the country's second largest city, Kharkiv, hurriedly fled with their families into a subway station / bomb shelter, fearing for their lives. Sights and sounds from this place of refuge were streamed live around the world on CNN. And as the camera panned across the crowd, the journalist anchoring coverage this morning said that these people shown on our screens are humans impacted by war. These are humans, the anchor said, humans, stated as if the largely American audience needed to be reminded that people on the other side of the world are living, breathing human beings, just like you and me. Or to say it another way, these Ukrainian people, and indeed the Russians who may kill them, are beloved children of God, created in God's image and likeness. This should not be a radical statement, especially in this country where an overwhelming majority of Americans claim to be people of faith. But I'm afraid that the CNN anchor's intuition that his viewers needed to be reminded of other people's humanity was not wrong. In fact, our country was founded with the idea that some people, namely people like me, white men, are worthy of full humanity, while others, women, Black and Indigenous people, and others are not fully human. And despite the great changes in the last 2+ centuries, there are still too many instances of the dehumanization of our sisters and brothers because of race, gender, sexual orientation, class, and more. People of faith, because of our deep faith commitments, should be the people most likely to treat others with dignity, respect, and love. Each of our faith traditions teaches us that loving one another is essential to faithfulness. In my tradition, one of the most famous stories about how we are called to love each other comes from Jesus telling what we often call the parable of the Good Samaritan. Found in the Gospel of Luke, this story seeks to answer the question, who is our neighbor? Jesus begins telling about a man who was robbed and beaten nearly to death on a road out in the middle of nowhere. Surprisingly, 2 religious leaders saw the injured man and did not stop to help, but another man, a Samaritan man, did not only stop to help, but also got the injured person to safety and paid for his care. A Samaritan, to Jesus's hearers, would have been a very unlikely neighbor because, among other things, Samaritans rejected worshiping at the Jerusalem temple. They were neighbors geographically, but they would not have been called good neighbors. In fact, it is more likely that they would have been called enemies. But in this parable, the Samaritan, the Jerusalem worship rejecter, was the one who showed mercy. This supposed enemy was, in truth, a neighbor worthy of love. Other biblical stories, including from the Hebrew Bible, share a similar message, including that of Jonah, the reluctant prophet who begrudgingly proclaimed God's love to the hated Ninevites and pouted when God, instead of destroying Jonah's enemies, showed them mercy. No one, no matter how evil or hated, is beyond God's love or is capable of losing their status as a beloved child of God. This is what faith should teach us. But the truth is that the Christian faith has not always led us to loving our neighbors. Indeed, almost 2 centuries ago in your neck of the woods, Frederick Douglass wrote about a white Christianity that, far from being a positive witness to God's love, actually made people value their Black sisters and brothers even less. Recounting the impact of his enslaver's supposed Christian conversion, Douglass wrote, "Prior to his conversion, the enslaver relied upon his own depravity to shield and sustain him in savage barbarity. But after his conversion, he found religious sanction and support for his slave-holding cruelty. Instead of encountering in his religious conversion a God who loves all of creation and calls us to do the same, the enslaver experienced a God who endorsed his hatred and cruelty, making it only stronger." Unfortunately, this is not merely a relic of Christianity centuries ago. Much closer to our own time, in his last book before his assassination, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote, "The majority of white Americans, and I would add white Christians, consider themselves sincerely committed to justice for the Negro, and they believe that American society is essentially hospitable to fair play and to steady growth toward a middle-class utopia, embodying racial harmony. Unfortunately," King continues, "this is a fantasy of self-deception and comfortable vanity." This is the place from which the raging rhetoric against critical race theory emerged. We white people, generally speaking, think that racism is over. We want to talk about the gains that Black people have made in the last decades, most notably the election of Barack Obama as president, as proof that we live in a post-racial society, that race no longer matters in our country, and as such, we do not want to subject our precious white children to the, quote, discomfort of talking about race. Tragically, of course, this is not a luxury that we offer to children of color, who learn often painfully and at ages far too young that their skin color makes them different, inferior, and perhaps even inherently bad. Christianity, instead, must be guided by the idea that the truth shall set us free, and therefore insist that all faithful Christians and all people of goodwill call out racism as the lie that it is. For we are all fully beloved children of God, created in the divine image, and no one is superior or inferior because of the color of our skin, because of the way that we worship or choose not to worship, because of our gender or sexual orientation or anything else. We are all children of God. We are all neighbors. And yes, we are all human. It is time, indeed, it is past time for all of us fully and unequivocally to love each other.
Thank you so much, Dr. Harrington. We appreciate that. I love what you said about, reminding people of our humanity, right? So that's a critical lesson for today. All right, so now we will go to Dr. Hakeem Rasheed.
First of all, I want to thank you all for the invitation to speak this evening. I feel like I'm at a disadvantage because I am not a theologian. I'm a Muslim and I'm a teacher, but I am not trained in the fine arts of theology like some of my colleagues here. I do want to talk about this issue of race, racism, critical race theory to some extent from this Islamic perspective. And I want to start out with the famous quotation from the last sermon of Prophet Muhammad. May God be pleased with him. He says that you know that every Muslim is the brother of another Muslim. All mankind is from Adam and Eve. An Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, nor a non-Arab has any superiority over an Arab. Also, a white has no superiority over a black, nor a black has any superiority over a white, except by piety and good action. Learn that every Muslim is a brother to every Muslim, and that the Muslims constitute one brotherhood. Nothing shall be legitimate to a Muslim that belongs to a fellow Muslim unless it was given freely and willingly. Do not, therefore, do injustice to yourselves. Remember, one day you will meet Allah and answer your deeds. So beware, do not stray from the path of righteousness after I am gone. Now, it was the message of this sermon that drew me at a personal level to Islam, and in a sense drew me away from the Christianity that I had been raised in. I was raised Catholic. Not a whole lot of African-American Catholics in this country, but I was raised Catholic in Flint, Michigan. I went to a church that had a variety of European images of saints. And I was raised on that picture of the Caucasian Jesus. As I grew and developed, I began to develop this sense of Black identity that many people were developing in the 1960s. And I can certainly remember going down to a church called the Shrine of the Black Madonna in Detroit and buying my first picture of a Black Jesus. Now, by this time, I hadn't really abandoned Catholicism or Christianity, but I was certainly beginning to question. And so I had a period of time where I was, I would call myself a confirmed agnostic. I didn't know if there was a God. And at that point, at 18, 19, 20, 21 years old, I really didn't care. But a yearning developed in me, a yearning for something more spiritually. And that's when I began to study comparative religion. And that's when I began to become attracted to Islam, and finally made my decision to convert, or as we say in our community, revert to Islam. And over time, I internalized this view of the brotherhood of Islam, but I also began to look at certain cracks in that ideology. And over time, I became exposed to the colorism that existed within the Muslim community. Now, what do I mean by that? If we look at, for example, relationships between light-skinned Arabs and dark-skinned Arabs, we see discrimination. If we look at relationships between light-skinned Pakistanis and dark-skinned Pakistanis, we see discrimination. So as I began to become more and more exposed to the realities of the Muslim world, I began to see that this notion of colorism, this idea that somehow dark skin was somehow inferior, really was something that permeated the Muslim world as well as the Christian world that I had come out of. Now, there was a difference in the sense that it was color and not necessarily race that was the determining factor in who was going to get discriminated against. But, it took me a while to digest that and realize that the Muslim world had been, in some respects, dominated by European colonialism in many of the same ways that the African world, and not necessarily the Muslim African world, but the non-Muslim and non-Christian African worlds had been dominated by colonialism. And part of that, that domination involved the whole phenomena of white supremacy. This idea that somehow white people were superior to everybody else. The Muslim world internalized that and it also internalized it from another perspective, and that was the I guess you'd say the colorism that existed in the Indian caste system. It's important to keep in mind that Pakistan, for example, was in a sense broken off from India. The Pakistanis we know today, 70 years ago, would have been considered Indians. So ultimately they broke away. They became their own country, but at the same time, they began to practice many of the same elements of the colorism of the Indian caste system that they had come to Islam from. So there we have two major elements of the Muslim world absorbing the same kinds of white supremacist attitudes and color consciousness that the Christian world had absorbed and internalized. So that's the challenge that we face, I think, as people of faith, going back to our original teachings, taking a look at the teachings of all of the prophets. And it's important that we recognize that all of the prophets from Adam to Muhammad taught the same thing. That was the brotherhood of man, the humanity of all of us. When we look at what's going on in Ukraine, when we look at the fact that a CNN correspondent has to say that these are human beings, we have to reflect on the various scenarios of war that we've seen coming out of Africa and Asia, whether it be Somalia, whether it be Ethiopia, whether it be Rwanda and Burundi. And I don't remember anybody coming on CNN and saying these are human beings. But at the same time, they are seen as lesser beings. The old phone gets to ringing, I'm sorry. They are seen as lesser beings because they're still coming out of this, in a sense, racist, white supremacist media context that tends to pay much more attention to what is going on in Europe, pay much more attention to what might be going on in America than it does to the African continent and the Asian continent. So with that, I'll close and move on to the next person.
Thank you, Dr. Rasheed. Yes, this idea of white supremacy and its impact on all of us around the world is it's very telling, and it's quite pervasive. So thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. We're going to turn next to Ms. Martha Woody.
Thank you, Tamika. And thanks to Khalil for the opportunity to participate tonight. First of all, I want to say thank you to the spiritual leader of our little congregation in Martinsville, Nadav Avital, and his wife Buffy, who were very helpful to me in preparing my remarks for tonight. I too am not a theologian, nor am I an expert in critical race theory, but I hope that some of the things I share tonight will resonate in some way. The first thing I want to do is to tell a joke, and that is that the only thing two Jews can agree on is that a third Jew is wrong. I first heard that joke from my husband, and I really thought it was just a joke, but in fact, it turns out to be true in many cases. As I said, I'm not an expert in critical race theory. I don't think most of the people who are discussing it right now are experts in critical race theory either. I think in many ways, it is a dog whistle to those who believe that our country was founded as a white Christian nation led by men, and that it should stay that way. I can also say that I believe educators ought to be teaching in age-appropriate ways all the history of our country and our world, about where we got things right, and certainly about where we got things wrong as well. But let me turn to the issue of faith, and what does the God of the Hebrew Scriptures tell us about race? And then again, because we're Jews, I will tell you about what the Jewish teachers and rabbis and sages have to tell us about what God tells us about race. The story of Passover, which will be coming up in April, it is exactly the weekend of Easter this year, is central to the story of the Jews. The Israelites were enslaved and oppressed, and I hope those words resonate with some folks. So the Israelites were enslaved and oppressed in Mitzrayim, which is the Hebrew word for Egypt. And God delivered them with an outstretched hand and a mighty arm. And then Deuteronomy goes on to say, Adonai, which is Hebrew for Lord, Adonai, your God, is the God of gods, the great God, who loves the stranger, and you are to love those who are strangers, for you yourselves were strangers in Mitzrayim. And this commandment to love the stranger occurs, depending on who's counting, 23, 36, or 46 times in the Hebrew Scriptures. So Jews, in other words, are commanded by God to pay it forward. The Hebrew prophets continue this lesson, and I'm depending at this point on Abraham Joshua Heschel, who is a great modern rabbi of blessed memory. He wrote that the prophet's great contribution to humanity was the discovery of the evil of indifference. From the prophets, we learn the necessity of interfering, of meddling in things that some might say were none of the prophet's business. But at the same time, they provided us with a model of concern for the wrongs that are done to others. From Isaiah, we have seek justice, relieve the oppressed, uphold the rights of the orphan, defend the cause of the widow. And from Amos, let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. From Jeremiah, God says, do what is just and right, do not wrong the stranger, uphold the rights of the poor and the needy. That is truly heeding me, declares Adonai. And so now I'll move on to more current events. I've mentioned Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. I could have made life easy for myself and just told you all to read his speech on religion and race that he gave at a conference in Chicago of the same name in January of 1963. That was where he met Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. for the first time. They became friends, and Rabbi Heschel marched with him at Selma. Of that experience, the rabbi said, I felt like my legs were praying. I have read several of Rabbi Heschel's books, Quest for God and The Sabbath being the two that I remember most clearly. They were quite deep and required quite careful reading in order to absorb the full meaning of the words that he wrote. But with regard to the speech that he gave in January of 1963, he was very clear and very direct. And here I'm quoting from his speech. Racism is worse than idolatry. Racism is Satanism, unmitigated evil. You cannot worship God and at the same time look at man as if he were a horse. Racial or religious bigotry must be recognized for what it is, blasphemy. Worship without compassion is worse than self-deception. It is an abomination. An honest estimation of the moral state of our society will disclose some are guilty, but all are responsible. So, in conclusion, here's how Judaism views racism. Our God says, I saved you. In return, you must be kind to the person who is not like you. The prophets warn us against the danger of indifference, of being a bystander to evil. And finally, from Rabbi Heschel, not only his description of racism as unmitigated evil, blasphemy, and abomination, but he also gave us a view towards the future. Seen in the light of our religious tradition, the race problem is God's gift to America, the test of our integrity, a magnificent spiritual opportunity. And let us say amen. Thank you.
Amen. Amen. Thank you so much for sharing that. You know, just talking about racism as an abomination and that concept of paying it forward, right? So when we think about the civil rights movement, if we think about any sort of injustices, you can almost always see that community, that pulling together between the Jewish communities and the African American communities or any other community, so that there are those in the Jewish community that have taken that very seriously. Thank you so much for sharing. And last but not least, we'll go to Reverend Park.
All right, I just unmuted myself. Good evening, everyone. And my special thanks to Sister Washington and Brother Shadid for inviting me, and it is an honor to share my thoughts with you. And I just want to send a shout out to my fellow United Methodist clergy attended here today, Reverend Lillian Gives, my good friend. Good to see you, Lillian. All right, so how does faith inform our discussion on racism in America? That was a question to all the presenters. So theologically, the creation story in the Bible tells us that God created humans according to God's image. We call it imago Dei, right? God's image. We are created in the image of God. In Genesis, book of Genesis, God said, let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness. But therefore, all humans are worthy because God created us. And all humans are good and have dignity. And all humans are to be treated equally and respectfully. However, who would imagine how just our skin color affects the whole human community? And as my brothers mentioned earlier, discrimination by skin color happens even within the same race and same ethnic group. And Korean community is not an exception. And that's why there are makeup companies making tons of skin whitening cream, and they're making fortunes on that. So that tells one side of culture, human culture. And how about in New Testament? So Jesus said in Luke chapter 10, verse 27, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. So it is the greatest commandment from Jesus Christ. And we as believers in Christ, in Christian community, take it seriously. However, our daily living, does it really shows? There's a perpetual task for many religious leaders. And then Jesus used the parable of Good Samaritan. The story, for those of you who are not familiar with that, a man walking on the road to Jericho and then robbed and beaten and left half dead in a ditch. The priest and Levite passed and ignored that. However, a Samaritan considered as a sinful, not a good man, he stopped by and took care of him, helped him, took him to the inn, and paid all the expenses until he gets well. And that parable came out because somebody asked to Jesus, so who is our neighbor? When you said, love your God and love your neighbors, then that Samaritan is your neighbor, the very person that you all think that they are sinful and not worthy. So our faith in God, regardless either Christian or Judaism or our Muslim community, our faith in God should guide us on what is right thing to do in our relationship with others, not just in the same faith community, but with all other humans. And United Methodist Church, which I belong to, we are trying our best to eradicate the racism and prejudices. And we even have a social principle in our denomination, and it clearly condemns the racism as evil. So one way to reduce racism is to know each other and have a caring relationship with each other. We need to exercise cultural humility. I think you all know about it. So cultural competency and cultural humility, those are two ways that we could work toward a racial harmony. And we need to exercise cultural humility, that is understanding that the world into which I was born is just one model of reality. So there is no superior or inferior culture. All cultures are equal and good. It's only different. Of course, even different cultures share whole vast majority in common, but there are a very small portion that is different. Cultural competency is to learn and understand other cultures and control our biases and adapt our behaviors and communication style. It sounds great. It sounds ideal. However, cultural competency sometimes has a risk of generalizing a culture. I don't think any culture can be painted with one brush. We may think we know about other cultures, but do we really know about other cultures? We don't even know our own culture that well, aren't we? And cultural humility is a mindset that we do not assume that we know about other culture, but we remain open-minded and willing to learn about other cultures. And let me share my perspectives on race issues in the US as an Asian American. And I noticed that the race issue in the US often said as only a black and white issue, which is not true. I mean, there are other races and other ethnic groups. And Asian American is one of the minority of minorities in the US, even though Asians take up about 60% of the whole world population. We're talking about in the US though. And then stigma is Asian American belong to neither side. So in the Black community, Asians are not dark enough. In Caucasian, white community, Asians are not light enough. Where do we go? And we are somewhat not accepted, neither groups. And we always stay forever foreigners. Whether you are fourth, fifth generation in the United States, somebody comes to Asian, asking, where are you from? I'm from here. No, where are you from originally? They are looking for where they are from, even though they were born in here for several generations. And I think that there needs to be an awareness that rather than labeling each other, sometimes a curiosity and willingness to learn more about other cultures. And I think that that is the way to eradicate our racism and promote our harmony within ourselves. And as one of the faith community leaders, I think Bowie also is faced with the same issue. And I'm especially grateful for Ms. Washington and Brother Shadid to include us in our discussion. And I'll stop right here because I think I'm done with the 9 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reverend Park, for sharing your unique perspective and just talking to us about that cultural humility, being open to learning about others. And so we've come to our question and answer portion, and the intention for this Q&A is to be informative and to shed more light on critical race theory for those who may have only seen it discussed in the news and on social media. So I have questions. If you have questions, please put them in the chat and we'll put them to the panelists. Our first question is for Dr. Rasheed. What is your definition of critical race theory? There are a few definitions, right? What's yours, and what do you think this theory's intended goal is?
Well, I'm going to go with the definition of critical race theory that's been put out there by Britannica magazine. Can you guys still see me?
Yes, we see you.
All right, I'm going to read this, and this is from Britannica. Critical race theory, intellectual and social movement, and loosely organized framework of legal analysis based on the premise that race is not a natural, biologically grounded feature of physically distinct subgroups of human beings, but a socially constructed, culturally invented category that is used to oppress and exploit people of color. Now, I accept that definition. Now there are other similar definitions, but I think the controversy around critical race theory has to do with the fact that the people who are criticizing it haven't read any viable definitions. They really have no idea what it is, what it's used for. And anytime you start talking about, we don't want critical race theory taught in our elementary schools, you don't know what you're talking about. You have no idea what you're talking about. I went over to my son's house the other day and looked on the table, and he has a child in kindergarten, and that child in kindergarten had brought home a book about George Washington. Now, wait a minute. I didn't get into it. I didn't get into who George Washington was and the slaves that he held and all of that. I said, I'll wait for that for another discussion. But that, to me, that's much more damaging than this whole notion of teaching critical race theory in the elementary school. So anyway, I'll accept the Britannica definition of it and any other halfway intellectual definition of it. But these critics don't know what they're talking about.
Thank you for your thoughts. All right, so we will go to the next question, and this is to Dr. Harrington. Given this definition, or maybe you have your own definition of critical race theory, is there a role for your faith tradition in the discussion, implementation of this concept to teach it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate that definition because I think it hits on some things that I was not able to get to in what I was talking about today. That one of the problems it seems like is that that too often we think of race as a problem that individuals have, that racism is a problem that individuals have, that I'm racist or whatever. But critical race theory is important for helping us to remember that structural racism is perhaps far more important than what I think or what somebody else thinks, because what it means is that racism is baked into the system. and that structural racism can operate without any regard to what I think or what I don't think, and continues to create inequities and injustice. So I think that's very, very important. And also, I think we cannot say enough that, I mean, as I said earlier, that race is a lie, that there is no such thing as race until 500 years ago, when people who look like me invented it for the sake of our own power. And everything else and everyone else, well, can I say be damned? But I mean, that's sort of what it was. But I absolutely think that in my tradition, that we have a tremendous amount of work that we need to do, because we are the ones that created the problem. We're the ones that started this. And as my wonderful professor at Louisville Seminary keeps reminding me, Dr. Angela Kauser, that Black people cannot solve the problem of racism, because Black people did not create the problems of racism. It's people who look like me that started all of this, that made this mess. And so I don't know. I think sometimes I'm pretty jaded, and I think that there are times when I have very little hope that white Christians can do what needs to be done. But it is definitely our responsibility, not just to be a part of it, but to lead in this work. And I hope for a day when white Christians can be known for that kind of work, as opposed to the hypocrisy that we are too often known for, because we say that we believe one thing and say that we're committed to one sort of thing, and too often we do and say just the opposite of what we claim is important to us. So I don't know. I guess I could go on and on about that, but it's my work. It's work for people like me, and if we don't do this work, then maybe it's too strong of a way to say it, but I think we need to quit calling ourselves Christians if we're not going to be about the work of trying to undo this hatred that we have created.
Amen. Thank you for that, Dr. Harrington. So I think Mr. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Mr. Foyer, Stanley Foyer, you'd like to share your comments with the group?
Thank you very much for inviting me in. I worked with someone many years ago who divided people into two groups, but I think it's actually something that we go back and forth between those two perspectives. And he talked about people who are lumpers and people who are splitters. And I think that from an existential and psychological view, we have those needs at times to sometimes take the one side and sometimes take the other, that it serves us personally to sometimes see the unity of people, to see what can be gained by being allied and being together. And at other times, it meets our psychological or existential needs to see ourselves as different from others, so that whether it's to say this person is superior to that person, or for whatever reason we find to differentiate people. I think that most of us would look at Serbs and Croats and say they're white Europeans and I don't see the difference. I think most of us would look at Hutus and Tutsis and say they're Black Africans and I can't tell the difference. But for some reason, it seems to meet some kind of, that there are times when it meets our deepest existential needs to say, I am this and you are that, whether it's the Protestant Catholic divide in the Christian tradition, the Sunni and Shiite divide in the Muslim tradition, the different denominations in Judaism, or the Ashkenazi Sephardi, Mizrahi traditions in Judaism. And I think that what maybe we can aim for is to say, how are the ways that we can limit the value to us of dividing and splitting people, and how can we increase the value to all of us of seeing everybody, no matter how they are, who they are, what they believe, what they look like, and see the unity of that. And I know that one of the earliest speakers, spoke about, differences in color among Pakistanis or Indians or different groups. My brother was involved in the civil rights movement as a student. He was born in 1941. And as a student, he was involved with SNCC. And I found a letter that he wrote as a child to Eleanor Roosevelt growing up in Virginia. And he was saying, I see racism around me, and I don't know how to comment to people who make comments that I find, wrong. He was premature, very small. He had visual problems, and he said, "I'm afraid to confront people because I don't want to get hurt." But I think this is something that all of us have to kind of look at and say, how is it that we can find a framework that moves humanity forward? Because it's very easy to find frameworks that of many different kinds that people use to separate and divide and discriminate and hurt each other. I don't know if kind of making a larger construct makes it more complicated or simpler, but I think that was kind of what thoughts came up to me listening to the different speakers in the program so far.
Thank you. Thank you for those comments. Yeah, just thinking about how we talk about the language around how we separate ourselves is very powerful. And one of the speakers talked earlier about the idea of race didn't exist, it was created. So thank you for your comments. I think we have time for one more question. And I'll put this to Dr. Rasheed. Is systemic racism a real subject that can be studied critically in hope of getting rid of it? What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I definitely think it can be studied. We can certainly look at the examples of it, beginning with the United States Constitution and the definition of Black people as 3/5 of a human being for voting purposes. We can look at, redlining. We can look at, discriminatory practices in terms of school admissions. There's a whole lot of structural things, systemic things that we can look at in this society, and it's already been done in many cases. So there's a body of research out there that does look at systemic racism. That's really not that hard to find. But America was built on systemic racism, and there's certain institutions that continue that whole notion of white supremacy. And I think that we have to call it what it is. It's white supremacy. That's what it's been historically. That's what America was founded on. And it's been systemic. It's been institutional. Our schools perpetuate it, and it's very clear.
And that structural racism, dismantling that is the key, right? Someone talked earlier about you can get rid of the racist, but if the structure still exists, what do we do about that? So actually, I think we have time for one more question. I'll put this to Ms. Woody. So what kinds of conversations are you guys having in your faith tradition about sort of on these kinds of topics, on these social justice issues, especially given, all of the turmoil that's been going on in the past, well, forever, but really in the past year and a half, it's kind of risen to the surface. Are you talking about that in your faith community? And if so, how?
I need to define my faith community as extending beyond the limits of OHEV Zion congregation, and it includes practicing Catholics and practicing Protestants and agnostics and a wide array of spiritual, of people who are spiritual in one way or another. I think at base, I think it's very difficult to discuss some of these things. And I think too, that it requires a rather enormous level of trust to get into these kinds of conversations, especially if you don't know where the other person's mind and heart is. Having said that, what I can say is when you have the time and the courage to have an open, direct, honest, respectful discussion, it is amazing how much common ground you can find. But it takes a lot of energy. And sometimes it's just easier to, in the military, they have a saying about stay in your lane. And, some days it's just easier to stay in your lane than it is to try to tackle the larger questions because you make yourself vulnerable when you open yourself up in terms of what I believe and what is close to my heart. But it is, I think that is the challenge of, on so many levels, both in the United States and with the world, that is the challenge that is critical to us today, is to find that common ground, because we are certainly, I think we have lost a lot of it. I think we have the opportunity to get it back if we're willing to put the work in.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our audience for participating and spending this time with us as we close out Black History Month. I hope you all found the discussion informative and helpful. And of course, thank you to my co-host, Khalil Rasheed, for all your work. And you all have a wonderful evening. Be safe, be happy, be healthy, be whole. Good night.